Okay, welcome. Weekly Marks at its new time, 2 p.m. 19 April. We're going to continue with our uh, slightly longish project of doing Karl Marx's theories of surplus value. And we're on chapter 4. I'm going to play the audiobook version of it and read through the text, and I will try to do some annotations in the chat. Um, and what else? I'll reproduce whatever yammering I have in the chat into the text, and afterwards. I hope you'll find this interesting. The idea of chapter 4, among other things, the issue of the theories of surplus value is, at least in a couple of versions, is considered book 4. But the reality, of course, is that the real project was volumes 1, 2, and 3. Project 4 has persisted for a variety of reasons. It has a historical-critical element to it. Um, it has a certain completeness to it, but that may be due to other factors. So it doesn't mean that we should just sort of forget it. And on the other hand, it's not that we should treat it like the Grundrisse. Um, so in terms of being either neglected or misunderstood or set to the side or etc. So, and clearly it was put out there quite during the formative time of really existing socialism. So there's some purpose it had, if anything. So here we go.
Chapter 4, Theories of Productive and Unproductive Labor. We come now to the last controversial point in Adam Smith's writings which we have to consider, the distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor. In Adam Smith's definition of what he calls productive labor, as distinguished from unproductive labor, we find the same two-sided approach as we have found on every question up to now. Jumbled together in his presentation, we find two definitions of what he calls productive labor, and to begin with, we will examine the first, correct definition. Section 1. Productive labor from the standpoint of capitalist production. Labor which produces surplus value. Productive labor, in its meaning for capitalist production, is wage labor which, exchanged against the variable part of capital, the part of the capital that is spent on wages, reproduces not only this part of the capital, or the value of its own labor power, but in addition produces surplus value for the capitalist. It is only thereby that commodity or money is transformed into capital, is produced as capital. Only that wage labor is productive, which produces capital. This is the same as saying that it reproduces, on an enlarged scale, the sum of value expended on it, or that it gives in return more labor than it receives in the form of wages. Consequently, only that labor power is productive, which produces a value greater than its own. The mere existence of a class of capitalists, and therefore of capital, depends on the productivity of labor, not, however, on its absolute, but on its relative productivity. For example, if a day's labor only sufficed to keep the worker alive, that is, to reproduce his labor power, speaking in an absolute sense, his labor would be productive because it would be reproductive, that is to say, because it constantly replaced the values equal to the value of its own labor power which it consumed. But in the capitalist sense, it would not be productive because it produced no surplus value. It produced, in fact, no new value, but only replaced the old. It would have consumed it, the value, in one form, in order to reproduce it in the other. And in this sense, it has been said that a worker is productive whose production is equal to his own consumption, and that a worker is unproductive who consumes more than he reproduces. Productivity in the capitalist sense is based on relative productivity, that the worker not only replaces an old value, but creates a new one, that he materializes more labor time in his product than is materialized in the product that keeps him in existence as a worker. It is this kind of productive wage labor that is the basis for the existence of capital. Assuming, however, that no capital exists, but that the worker appropriates his surplus labor himself, the excess of values that he has created over the values that he consumes, then one could say only of this labor that it is truly productive, that is, that it creates new values. Section 2. Views of the physiocrats and mercantilists on productive labor. This conception of productive labor follows naturally from Adam Smith's view of the origin of surplus value, that is, of the nature of capital. Insofar as he holds to this conception, he is following a course that was taken by the physiocrats and even by the mercantilists. He only frees it from misconceptions, and in this way brings out its inner kernel. Though wrong in thinking that only agricultural labor was productive, the physiocrats put forward the correct view that from the capitalist standpoint, only that labor is productive which creates a surplus value, and in fact a surplus value not for itself, but for the owner of the conditions of production. Labor which produces a net product not for itself, but for the landowner. For the surplus value or surplus labor time is materialized in surplus produce or net product. But here again, they have a wrong conception of this, inasmuch as there is, for example, more wheat than laborers and farmers eat. But also, in the case of cloth, there is more than what cloth manufacturers, workmen and master, need for their own clothing. Surplus value itself is wrongly conceived because they have a wrong idea of value and reduce it to the use value of labor, not to labor time, social, homogeneous labor. Nevertheless, there remains the correct definition that only the wage labor which creates more value than it costs is productive. Adam Smith frees this definition from the wrong conception with which the physiocrats linked it. If we go back from the physiocrats to the mercantilists, there too we find one aspect of their theory which contains the same view of productive labor, even though they were not conscious of it. The basis of their theory was the idea that labor is only productive in those branches of production whose products, when sent abroad, bring back more money than they have cost, or than had to be exported in exchange for them, which therefore enabled a country to participate to a greater degree in the products of newly opened gold and silver mines. They saw that in these countries there was a rapid growth of wealth and of the middle class. What in fact was the source of this influence exerted by gold? Wages did not rise in proportion to the prices of commodities, that is, wages fell, and because of this, relative surplus labor increased and the rate of profit rose, not because the worker had become more productive, but because the absolute wage, that is to say the quantity of means of existence which the laborer received, was forced down. In a word, because the position of the workers grew worse. In these countries, therefore, labor was in fact more productive for those who employed it. This fact was linked with the influx of the precious metals, and it was this, though they were only ever dimly aware of it, which led the mercantilists to declare that labor employed in such branches of production was alone productive. Quote, "The remarkable increase of population, which has taken place in almost every European state during the last 50 or 60 years, has perhaps proceeded chiefly from the increased productiveness of the American mines. An increased abundance of the precious metals, of course as a result of the fall in their real value, raises the price of commodities in a greater proportion than the price of labor. It depresses the condition of the laborer, and at the same time increases the gains of his employer, who is thus induced to enlarge his circulating capital to the utmost of his ability, to hire as many hands as he has the means to pay. And it has been seen that this is precisely the state of things most favorable to the increase of the people. Mr. Malthus observes that the discovery of the mines of America, during the time that it raised the price of corn between 3 and 4 times, did not nearly so much as double the price of labor. The price of commodities, intended for home consumption, of corn for instance, does not immediately rise in consequence of an influx of money, but as the rate of profit in agricultural employments is thus depressed below the rate of profit in manufactures, capital will gradually be withdrawn from the former to the latter. Thus all capital comes to yield higher profits than formerly, and a rise of profits is always equivalent to a fall of wages." End quote from John Barton, Observations on the Circumstances which Influence the Condition of the Laboring Classes of Society, published in London in 1817. So firstly, according to Barton, in the second half of the 18th century, there was a repetition of the same phenomenon as that which, from the last third of the 16th century and in the 17th, has given the impulse to the mercantile system. Secondly, as only exported goods were measured in gold and silver on the basis of its reduced value, while those for home consumption continued to be measured in gold and silver according to its former value, until competition among the capitalists put an end to this measuring by two different standards, labor in the former branches of production appeared to be directly productive, that is, creating surplus value, through the depression of wages below their former level. Section 3. The duality in Smith's conception of productive labor. His first explanation, the view of productive labor as labor exchanged for capital. The second, wrong conception of productive labor which Smith develops is so interwoven with the correct one that the two follow each other in rapid succession in the same passage. To illustrate the first conception, it is therefore necessary to tear the quotations into separate parts. Quote, "There is one sort of labor which adds to the value of the subject upon which it is bestowed. There is another which has no such effect. The former, as it produces a value, may be called productive, the latter unproductive labor. Thus the labor of a manufacturer adds generally to the value of the materials which he works upon, that of his own maintenance and of his master's profit. The labor of a menial servant, on the contrary, adds to the value of nothing. Though the manufacturer has his wages advanced to him by his master, he in reality costs him no expense, the value of those wages being generally restored together with a profit in the improved value of the subject upon which his labor is bestowed. But the maintenance of a menial servant never is restored. A man grows rich by employing a multitude of manufacturers. He grows poor by maintaining a multitude of menial servants." End quote from Adam Smith. In this passage, and in its continuation to be quoted later, the contradictory definitions jostle each other even more closely. What is in the main and preeminently understood by productive labor is labor which produces a surplus value, quote, his master's profit, end quote, in addition to the reproduction of the value of his, the laborer's, own maintenance. Also, the industrialist could not grow rich by employing a multitude of manufacturers, that is, working men, unless the latter, in addition to the value which their own maintenance costs, added also a surplus value. Secondly, however, in this passage, Adam Smith treats as productive labor, labor which in general produces a value. Leaving this latter statement out of account for the moment, however, we will first cite other passages in which the first conception is partly repeated, partly formulated more sharply, but particularly also further developed. If the quantity of food and clothing which were consumed by unproductive hands had been distributed among productive hands, they would have reproduced, together with a profit, the full value of their consumption. Here, the productive laborer is quite explicitly one who not only produces for the capitalist the full value of the means of subsistence contained in his wages, but reproduces it for him with a profit. Only labor which produces capital is productive labor. Commodities or money become capital, however, through being exchanged directly for labor power, and exchanged only in order to be replaced by more labor than they themselves contain. For the use value of labor power to the capitalist as a capitalist does not consist in its actual use value, in the usefulness of this particular concrete labor, that it is spinning labor, weaving labor, and so on. He is as little concerned with this as with the use value of the product of this labor as such, since for the capitalist, the product is a commodity, even before its first metamorphosis, not an article of consumption. What interests him in the commodity is that it has more exchange value than he paid for it, and therefore the use value of the labor is for him that he gets back a greater quantity of labor time than he has paid out in the form of wages. Included among these productive workers, of course, are all those who contribute in one way or another to the production of the commodity, from the actual operative to the manager or engineer, as distinct from the capitalist. And so even the latest English official report on the factories explicitly includes in the category of employed wage laborers all persons employed in the factories and in the offices attached to them, with the exception of the manufacturers themselves. Productive labor is here defined from the standpoint of capitalist production, and Adam Smith here got to the very heart of the matter, hit the nail on the head. This is one of his greatest scientific merits. As Malthus rightly observed, this critical differentiation between productive and unproductive labor remains the basis of all bourgeois political economy, that he defines productive labor as labor which is directly exchanged with capital. That is, he defines it by the exchange through which the conditions of production of labor, and value in general, whether money or commodity, are first transformed into capital, and labor into wage labor in its scientific meaning. This also establishes absolutely what unproductive labor is. It is labor which is not exchanged with capital, but directly with revenue, that is, with wages or profit, including, of course, the various categories of those who share as co-partners in the capitalist profit, such as interest and rent. Where all labor, in part, still pays itself, like, for example, the agricultural labor of the serfs, and in part is directly exchanged for revenue, like the manufacturing labor in the cities of Asia, no capital and no wage labor exists in the sense of bourgeois political economy. These definitions are therefore not derived from the material characteristics of labor, neither from the nature of its product, nor from the particular character of the labor as concrete labor, but from the definite social form, the social relations of production, within which the labor is realized. An actor, for example, or even a clown, according to this definition, is a productive laborer if he works in the service of a capitalist, an entrepreneur, to whom he returns more labor than he receives from him in the form of wages, while a jobbing tailor who comes to the capitalist's house and patches his trousers for him, producing a mere use value for him, is an unproductive laborer. The former's labor is exchanged with capital, the latter's with revenue. The former's labor produces a surplus value, in the latter's revenue is consumed. Productive and unproductive labor is here throughout conceived from the standpoint of the possessor of money, from the standpoint of the capitalist, not from that of the workman. Hence the nonsense written by Ganil, etc., who have so little understanding of the matter that they raise the question whether the labor or service of function of the prostitute, flunky, etc. brings in returns. A writer is a productive laborer not insofar as he produces ideas, but insofar as he enriches the publisher who publishes his works, or if he is a wage laborer for a capitalist. The use value of the commodity in which the labor of a productive worker is embodied may be of the most futile kind. The material characteristics are in no way linked with its nature, which, on the contrary, is only the expression of a definite social relation of production. It is a definition of labor which is derived not from its content or its result, but from its particular social form. On the other hand, on the assumption that capital has conquered the whole of production, and that therefore a commodity, as distinct from a mere use value, is no longer produced by any laborer who is himself the owner of the conditions of production for producing this commodity, that therefore only the capitalist is the producer of commodities, the sole commodity accepted being labor power, then revenue must be exchanged either against commodities, which capital alone produces and sells, or against labor, which, just like those commodities, is bought in order to be consumed. That is, only for the sake of its particular material characteristics, its use value, for the sake of these services, which, through its particular material characteristics, it renders to its buyer and consumer. For the producer of these services, the services rendered are commodities. They have a definite use value, imaginary or real, and a definite exchange value. For the buyer, however, these services are mere use values, objects in which he consumes his revenue. These unproductive laborers do not receive their share of revenue, their co-partnership in the commodities produced by productive labor, gratis. They must buy their share in them, but they have nothing to do with their production. It is, however, in any case clear, the greater part of the revenue, that is wages and profit, that is spent on commodities produced by capital, the less the part that can be spent on the services of unproductive laborers, and vice versa. The determinate material form of the labor, and therefore of its product, in itself has nothing to do with this distinction between productive and unproductive labor. For example, the cooks and waiters in a public hotel are productive laborers, insofar as their labor is transformed into capital for the proprietor of the hotel. These same persons are unproductive laborers as menial servants, inasmuch as I do not make capital out of their services, but spend revenue on them. In fact, however, if I am the consumer, then these same persons are also, for me, unproductive laborers even in the hotel. Quote, that part of the annual produce of the land and labor of any country which replaces a capital never is immediately employed to maintain any but productive hands. It pays the wages of productive labor only. That which is immediately destined for constituting a revenue, either as profit or as rent, may maintain indifferently either productive or unproductive hands. Whatever part of his stock a man employs as capital, he always expects it to be replaced to him with a profit. He employs it, therefore, in maintaining productive hands only, and after having served in the function of a capital to him, it constitutes a revenue to them. Whenever he employs any part of it in maintaining unproductive hands of any kind, that part is, from that moment, withdrawn from his capital and placed in his stock reserved for immediate consumption. End quote. To the extent that capital conquers the whole of production, and therefore the home and petty form of industry, in short, industry intended for self-consumption, not producing commodities, to the extent that this disappears, it is clear that the unproductive laborers, those whose services are directly exchanged against revenue, will for the most part be performing only personal services, and only an inconsiderable part of them, like cooks, seamstresses, jobbing tailors, and so on, will produce material use values. That they produce no commodities follows from the nature of the case. For the commodity as such is never an immediate object of consumption, but a bearer of exchange value. Consequently, only a quite insignificant part of these unproductive laborers can play a direct part in material production once the capitalist mode of production has developed. They participate in it only through the exchange of their services against revenue. This does not prevent, as Adam Smith remarks, the value of the services of these unproductive laborers being determined and determinable in the same way as that of the productive laborers, that is, by the production costs involved in maintaining or producing them. Other factors also come into play in this connection, but they are not relevant here. The labor power of the productive worker is a commodity for the worker himself. So is that of the unproductive worker. But the productive worker produces commodities for the buyer of his labor power. The unproductive worker produces for him a mere use value, not a commodity, either imaginary or real. It is characteristic of the unproductive worker that he produces no commodities for his buyer, but indeed receives commodities from him. Quote, the labor of some of the most respectable orders in the society is, like that of menial servants, unproductive of any value. The sovereign, for example, with all the officers both of justice and war who serve under him, the whole army and navy, are unproductive laborers. They are servants of the public, and are maintained by a part of the annual produce of the industry of other people. In the same class must be ranked churchmen, lawyers, physicians, men of letters of all kinds, players, buffoons, musicians, opera singers, opera dancers, etc. It itself has been said, this distinction between productive and unproductive labor has nothing to do either with the particular speciality of the labor or with the particular use value in which this special labor is incorporated. In the one case, the labor is exchanged with capital, in the other with revenue. In the one case, the labor is transformed into capital and creates a profit for the capitalist. In the other case, it is an expenditure, one of the articles in which revenue is consumed. For example, the workman employed by a piano maker is a productive laborer. His labor not only replaces the wages that he consumes, but in the product, the piano, the commodity which the piano maker sells, there is a surplus value over and above the value of the wages. But assume, on the contrary, that I buy all the materials required for a piano, or for all that matters, the laborer himself may possess them, and that instead of buying the piano in a shop, I have made it for myself in my own house. The workman who makes the piano is now an unproductive laborer, because his labor is exchanged directly against my revenue. Section 4. Adam Smith's second explanation, the view of productive labor as labor which is realized in a commodity. It is, however, clear that in the same measure as capital subjugates to itself the whole of production, that is to say that all commodities are produced for the market and not for immediate consumption, and the productivity of labor rises in this same measure, there will also develop more and more a material difference between productive and unproductive laborers, inasmuch as the former, apart from minor exceptions, will exclusively produce commodities, which the latter, with minor exceptions, will perform only personal services. Hence, the former class will produce immediate material wealth consisting of commodities, all commodities except those which consist of labor power itself. This is one of the aspects which lead Adam Smith to put forward other points of difference, in addition to the first and in principle determining specific difference between productive and unproductive labor. Thus, following through various associations of ideas, he says, quote, "The labor of a menial servant, as distinct from that of a manufacturer, adds to the value of nothing. The maintenance of a menial servant never is restored. A man grows rich by employing a multitude of manufacturers. He grows poor by maintaining a multitude of menial servants. The labor of the latter, however, has its value and deserves its reward as well as that of the former. But the labor of the manufacturer fixes and realizes itself in some particular subject or vendible commodity, which lasts for some time at least after that labor is past. It is, as it were, a certain quantity of labor stocked and stored up to be employed, if necessary, upon some other occasion. That subject, or what is the same thing, the price of that subject, can afterwards, if necessary, put into motion a quantity of labor equal to that which had originally produced it. The labor of the menial servant, on the contrary, does not fix or realize itself in any particular subject or vendible commodity. His services generally perish in the very instant of their performance, and seldom leave any trace or value behind them, for which an equal quantity of service could afterwards be procured. The labor of some of the most respectable orders in the society is, like that of menial servants, unproductive of value, and does not fix or realize itself in any permanent subject or vendible commodity. To define the unproductive laborer, we here have the following determinants, which, at the same time, reveal the links in Adam Smith's train of thought. The labor of the unproductive worker is unproductive of value, adds to the value of nothing, the maintenance of the unproductive worker never is restored, it does not fix or realize itself in any particular subject or vendible commodity. On the contrary, his services generally perish in the very instant of their performance, and seldom leave any trace or value behind them for which an equal quantity of service could afterwards be procured. Finally, his labor does not fix or realize itself in any permanent subject or vendible commodity. Here, productive of value or unproductive of value is used in a different sense from that in which those terms were used originally. The reference is no longer to the production of a surplus value, which in itself implies the reproduction of an equivalent for the value consumed. But according to this presentation, the labor of a worker is called productive insofar as he replaces the consumed value by an equivalent, by adding to any material, through his labor, a quantity of value equal to that which was contained in his wages. Here, the definition by social form, the determination of productive and unproductive laborers by their relation to capitalist production, is abandoned. From Chapter 9 of Book 4, where Adam Smith criticizes the doctrine of the physiocrats, it can be seen that he came to make this aberration as a result partly of his opposition to the physiocrats and partly under their influence. If a worker merely replaces each year the equivalent of his wages, then for the capitalist, he is not a productive worker. He does indeed replace his wages, the purchase price of his labor, but the transaction is absolutely the same as if this capitalist had bought the product which this labor produces. He pays for the labor contained in the constant capital and in the wages. He possesses the same quantity of labor in the form of the commodity as he had before in the form of money. This money is therefore not transformed into capital. In this case, it is the same as if the worker himself owned his conditions of production. He must each year deduct the value of the conditions of production from the value of his annual product in order to replace them. What he consumed, or could consume annually, would be that portion of the value of his product equal to the new labor added to his constant capital during the year. In this case, therefore, it would not be capitalist production. The first reason why Adam Smith calls this kind of labor productive is that the physiocrats call it sterile and non-productive. Thus, Adam Smith tells us in the chapter referred to, quote, "First, this class, namely the industrial classes who do not carry on agriculture, it is acknowledged by the physiocrats, reproduces annually the value of its own annual consumption, and continues at least the existence of a stock or capital which maintains and employs it. Farmers and country laborers, indeed, over and above the stock which maintain and employ them, reproduce annually a net produce, a free rent to the landlord. The labor of the farmers and country laborers is certainly more productive than that of the merchants, artificers, and manufacturers. The superior produce of the one class, however, does not render the other barren or unproductive." Here, therefore, Adam Smith falls back into the physiocratic standpoint. The real productive labor, which produces a surplus value, and therefore a net produce, is agricultural labor. He abandons his own view of surplus value, and accepts that of the physiocrats. At the same time, he asserts, as against the physiocrats, that manufacturing, and according to him also commercial labor, is nevertheless also productive, even if not in this highest sense of the word. He therefore drops the definition by social form, the definition of what a productive laborer is from the standpoint of capitalist production, and asserts, in opposition to the physiocrats, that the non-agricultural industrial class reproduces its own wages. That is, it does after all produce a value equal to the value it consumes, and thereby continues at least the existence of the stock or capital which employs it. Hence arises, under the influence of and in contradiction to the physiocrats, his second definition of what is productive labor. Secondly, says Adam Smith, it seems, on this account, altogether improper to consider artificers, manufacturers, and merchants in the same light as menial servants. The labor of menial servants does not continue the existence of the fund which maintains and employs them. Their maintenance and employment is altogether at the expense of their masters, and the work which they perform is not of a nature to repay expense. That work consists in services which perish generally in the very instant of their performance, and does not fix or realize itself in any vendible commodity which can replace the value of their wages or maintenance. The labor, on the contrary, of artificers, manufacturers, and merchants naturally does fix and realize itself in some such vendible commodity. It is on this account that in the chapter in which I treat of productive and unproductive labor, I have classed artificers, manufacturers, and merchants among the productive laborers, and menial servants among the barren or unproductive. As soon as capital has mastered the whole of production, revenue, insofar as it is at all exchanged against labor, will not be exchanged directly against labor which produces commodities, but against mere services. It is exchanged partly against commodities which are to serve as use values, and partly against services, which as such are consumed as use values. A commodity, as distinguished from labor power itself, is a material thing confronting man, a thing of a certain utility for him, in which a definite quantity of labor is fixed or materialized. So we come to the definition already in essence contained in point 1. A productive laborer is one whose labor produces commodities, and indeed such a laborer does not consume more commodities than he produces, that his labor costs. His labor fixes and realizes itself in some such vendible commodity, in any vendible commodity which can replace the value of their wages and maintenance, that is, of the workers who produce these commodities. By producing commodities, the productive worker constantly reproduces the variable capital which he constantly consumes in the form of wages. He constantly produces the fund which pays him, which maintains and employs him. In the first place, Adam Smith naturally includes in the labor which fixes or realizes itself in a vendible and exchangeable commodity all intellectual labors which are directly consumed in material production. Not only the worker working directly with his hands, or a machine, but overlooker, engineer, manager, clerk, etc. In a word, the labor of the whole personnel required in a particular sphere of material production to produce a particular commodity, whose joint labor, that is their cooperation, is required for commodity production. In fact, they add their aggregate labor to the constant capital, and increase the value of the product by this amount. Secondly, Adam Smith says that on the whole, generally, this is not the case with the labor of unproductive laborers. Even though capital has conquered material production, and so by and large home industry has disappeared, and the industry of the small craftsman who makes use values directly for the consumer at his home, even then, Adam Smith knows quite well a seamstress whom I get to come to my house to sew shirts, or a workman to repair furniture, or the servant who scrubs and cleans the house, etc., or the cook who gives meat and other things their palatable form, fix their labor in a thing, and in fact increase the value of these things in exactly the same way as the seamstress who sews in a factory, the engineer who repairs the machine, the laborers who clean the machine, or the cook who cooks in a hotel as the wage laborer of a capitalist. These use values are also potentially commodities. The shirts may be sent to the pawn shop, the house resold, the furniture put up to auction, and so on. Thus, these persons have potentially produced commodities and added value to the objects on which they have worked. But this is a very small category among unproductive workers, and does not apply either to the mass of menial servants or to parsons, government officials, soldiers, musicians, and so on. But however large or small the number of these unproductive laborers may be, this much, at any rate, is evident, and is admitted by the limitation expressed in the phrase, services which perish generally in the very instant of their performance. That neither the special kind of labor nor the external form of its product necessarily make it productive or unproductive. The same labor can be productive when I buy it as a capitalist, as a producer, in order to create more value, and unproductive when I buy it as a consumer, as a sender of revenue, in order to consume its use value, no matter whether this use value perishes with the activity of the labor power itself, or materializes and fixes itself in an object. The cook in the hotel produces a commodity for the person who, as a capitalist, has bought her labor, the hotel proprietor. The consumer of the mutton chops has to pay for her labor, and this labor replaces for the hotel proprietor, apart from profit, the fund out of which he continues to pay the cook. On the other hand, if I buy the labor of a cook for her to cook meat, etc. for me, not to make use of it as labor in general, but to enjoy it, to use it as that particular concrete kind of labor, then her labor is unproductive, in spite of the fact that this labor fixes itself in a material product, and could, just as well in its result, be a vendible commodity, as it in fact is for the hotel proprietor. The great difference, the conceptual difference, however, remains. The cook does not replace for me, the private person, the fund from which I pay her, because I buy her labor not as a value-creating element, but purely for the sake of its use value. Her labor as little replaces for me the fund with which I pay for it, that is, her wages, as for example the dinner I eat in the hotel in itself enables me to buy and eat the same dinner again a second time. This distinction, however, is also to be found between commodities. The commodity which the capitalist buys to replace his constant capital, for example, cotton material if he is a cotton printer, replaces its value in the printed cotton. But if, on the other hand, he buys it in order to consume the cotton itself, then the commodity does not replace his outlay. The largest part of society, that is to say the working class, must incidentally perform this kind of labor for itself, But it is only able to perform it when it has already labored productively. It can only cook meat for itself when it has produced a wage with which to pay for the meat. And it can only keep its furniture and dwelling clean, it can only polish its boots when it has produced the value of the furniture, house rent, and boots. To this class of productive laborers itself, therefore, the labor which they perform for themselves appears as unproductive labor. This unproductive labor never enables them to repeat the same unproductive labor a second time unless they have previously labored productively. Thirdly, on the other hand, an entrepreneur of theaters, concerts, brothels, etc. buys the temporary disposal over the labor power of the actors, musicians, prostitutes, etc. In fact, in a roundabout way that is only a formal economic interest. In its result, the process is the same. He buys this so-called unproductive labor, whose services perish in the very instant of their performance and do not fix or realize themselves in any permanent, subject, or vendable commodity. The sale of these to the public provides him with wages and profit, and these services, which he has thus bought, enable him to buy them again. That is to say, they themselves renew the fund from which they are paid. The same is true, for example, of the labor of clerks employed by a lawyer in his office, except for the fact that these services, as a rule, also embody themselves in very bulky, particular subjects, in the form of immense bundles of documents. It is true that these services are paid for to the entrepreneur out of the revenue of the public, but it is no less true that this holds good for all products insofar as they enter into individual consumption. It is true that the country cannot export these services as such, but it can export those who perform the services. Thus, France exports dancing masters, cooks, etc., and Germany schoolmasters. With the export of the dancing master or the schoolmaster, however, his revenue is also exported, while the export of dancing shoes and books brings a return to the country. If, therefore, on the one hand, a part of the so-called unproductive labor embodies itself in material use values, which might just as well be commodities, that is, vendable commodities, so, on the other hand, a part of the services, in the strict sense, which assume no objective form, which do not receive an existence as things separate from those performing the services, and do not enter into a commodity as a component part of its value, may be bought with capital by the immediate purchaser of the labor, may replace their own wages, and yield a profit for him. In short, the production of these services can be in part subsumed under capital, just as a part of the labor which embodies itself in useful things is bought directly by revenue and is not subsumed under capitalist production. Fourthly, the whole world of commodities can be divided into two great parts. First, labor power. Second, commodities as distinct from labor power itself. As to the purchase of such services as those which train labor power, maintain or modify it, etc., in a word, give it a specialized form, or even only maintain it. Thus, for example, the schoolmaster service, insofar as it is industrially necessary or useful, the doctor's service, insofar as he maintains health, and so conserves the source of all values, labor power itself. These are services which yield in return a vendable commodity, etc., namely, labor power itself, into whose costs of production or reproduction these services enter. Adam Smith knew, however, how little education enters into the cost of production of the mass of working men. And in any case, the doctor's services belong to the faux frais of production. They can be counted as the cost of repairs for labor power. Let us assume that wages and profit fell simultaneously in total value, from whatever cause. For example, because the nation had grown lazier, and at the same time in use value, because labor had become less productive owing to bad harvests, etc. In a word, that the part of the product whose value is equal to the revenue declines, because less new labor has been added in the past year, and because the labor added has been less productive. If, in such conditions, the capitalist and workman wanted to consume the same amount of value in material things as they did before, they would have to buy less of the services of the doctor, schoolmaster, etc. And if they were compelled to continue the same outlay for both these services, then they would have to restrict their consumption of other things. It is therefore clear that the labor of the doctor and the schoolmaster does not directly create the fund out of which they are paid, although their labors enter into the production costs of the fund which creates all values whatsoever, namely the production costs of labor power. Adam Smith continues. Thirdly, it seems, upon every supposition, improper to say that the labor of the artificers, manufacturers, and merchants does not increase the real revenue of the society. Though we should suppose, for example, as it seems to be supposed in this system, that the value of the daily, monthly, and yearly consumption of this class was exactly equal to that of its daily, monthly, and yearly production, yet it would not from thence follow that its labor added nothing to the real revenue, to the real value of the annual produce of the land and labor of society. An artificer, for example, who, in the first 6 months after the harvest, executes 10 pounds worth of work, though he should in the same time consume 10 pounds worth of corn and other necessaries, yet really adds the value of 10 pounds to the annual produce of the land and labor of the society. While he has been consuming a half-yearly revenue of 10 pounds worth of corn and other necessaries, he has produced an equal value of work, capable of purchasing, either to himself or to some other person, an equal half-yearly revenue. The value, therefore, of what has been consumed and produced during these 6 months is equal not to 10 but to 20 pounds. It is possible indeed that no more than 10 pounds worth of this value may have ever existed at any one moment of time. But if the 10 pounds worth of corn and other necessaries which were consumed by the artificer had been consumed by a soldier or by a menial servant, the value of that part of the annual produce which existed at the end of the 6 months would have been 10 pounds less than it actually is in consequence of the labor of the artificer. Though the value of what the artificer produces, therefore, should not at any one moment of time be supposed greater than the value he consumes, yet at every moment of time, the actually existing value of goods in the market is, in consequence of what he produces, greater than it otherwise would be. Is not the total value of the commodities at any time in the market greater as a result of the unproductive labor than it would be without this labor? Are there not at every moment of time in the market, alongside wheat and meat, etc., also prostitutes, lawyers, sermons, concerts, theaters, soldiers, politicians, etc.? These people do not get the corn and other necessaries or pleasures for nothing. In return, they give or pester us with their services, which, as such services, have a use value, and because of their production costs, also an exchange value. Reckoned as consumable articles, there is at every moment of time, alongside the consumable articles existing in the form of goods, a quantity of consumable articles in the form of services. The total quantity of consumable articles is therefore at every moment of time greater than it would be without the consumable services. Secondly, however, the value too is greater, for it is equal to the value of the commodities which are given for these services, and is equal to the value of the services themselves. Since here, as in every exchange of commodity for commodity, equal value is given for equal value, the same value is therefore present twice over, once on the buyer's side and once on the seller's. Adam Smith goes on to say, in reference to the physiocrats, when the patrons of this system assert that the consumption of artificers, manufacturers, and merchants is equal to the value of what they produce, they probably mean no more than that their revenue, or the fund destined for their consumption, is equal to it. That is, to the value of what they produce. In this, the physiocrats were right in relation to workmen and employers taken together, rent forming only a special category of the latter's profit. Adam Smith notes on the same occasion, that is, in his criticism of the physiocrats in Book 4, Chapter 9, the annual produce of the lands and labor of any society can be augmented only in two ways. Either first, by some improvement in the productive powers of the useful labor actually maintained within it, or secondly, by some increase in the quantity of that labor. The improvement in the productive powers of useful labor depends first upon the improvement in the ability of the workman, and secondly, upon that machinery with which he works. The increase in the quantity of useful labor actually employed within any society must depend altogether upon the increase of capital which employs it, and the increase of that capital must be exactly equal to the amount of the savings from the revenue, either of the particular persons who manage and direct the employment of that capital, or of some other persons who lend it to them. Here we have a double vicious circle. First, the annual product is augmented by greater productivity of labor. All means to augment this productivity, insofar as this is not due to accidents of nature, such as specially favorable seasons, etc., require an increase of capital. But in order to increase the capital, the annual product of labor must be increased. First circle. Secondly, the annual product can be augmented by an increase in the quantity of labor employed. The quantity of labor employed, however, can only be increased if the capital which employs it is first increased. Second circle. Adam Smith helps himself out of both vicious circles with savings, by which he means in fact the transformation of revenue into capital. To think of the whole profit as revenue for the capitalist is already in itself wrong. The law of capitalist production requires, on the contrary, that a part of the surplus labor, of the unpaid labor performed by the workman, should be transformed into capital. When the individual capitalist functions as a capitalist, that is, as a functionary of capital, he himself may think of this as saving, but it also appears to him as a necessary reserve fund. The increase of the quantity of labor does not, however, depend only on the number of workmen, but also on the length of the working day. The quantity of labor can therefore be increased without increasing the part of the capital that is converted into wages. Similarly, on this assumption, there would be no need to increase the machinery, etc., although it would wear out more quickly, but this makes no difference. The only thing that would have to be increased is the part of the raw material that resolves itself into seed, etc., and it remains true that taking a single country, excluding foreign trade, surplus labor must first be applied to agriculture before it becomes possible in the industries which get their raw materials from agriculture. A part of these raw materials, such as coal, iron, wood, fish, etc., the last name, for example, is manure. In a word, all fertilizers other than animal manures can be got by merely increasing the labor, the number of laborers remaining the same. There can therefore be no lack of these. On the other hand, it has been shown above that the increase of productivity in its origin always presupposes merely the concentration of capital, not the accumulation of capital. Later, however, each process supplements the other. The reason why the physiocrats preached laissez-faire, laissez-passer, in short, free competition, is correctly stated in the following passages from Adam Smith. The trade which is carried on between these two different sets of people, that is the country and the town, consists ultimately in a certain quantity of rude produce exchanged for a certain quantity of manufactured produce. The dearer the latter, therefore, the cheaper the former, and whatever tends in any country to raise the price of manufactured produce tends to lower that of the rude produce of the land, and thereby to discourage agriculture. but all fetters and restrictions placed on manufacturers and foreign trade make manufactured commodities, etc., dearer. Smith's second view of productive and unproductive labor, or rather the view that is interwoven with his other view, therefore amounts to this, that the former is labor which produces commodities, and the latter is labor which does not produce any commodity. He does not deny that the one kind of labor equally with the other is a commodity. See above, the labor of the latter has its value and deserves its reward as well as that of the former. That is, from the economic standpoint, there is no question of moral or other standpoint in the case of either one or the other kind of labor. The concept of commodity, however, implies that the labor embodies, materializes, realizes itself in its product. Labor itself, in its immediate being, in its living existence, cannot be directly conceived as a commodity, but only labor power, of which labor itself is the temporary manifestation. Just as it is only in this way that wage labor, in the true sense, can be explained, so it is with unproductive labor, which Adam Smith throughout defines by the costs of production required to produce the unproductive laborer. A commodity must therefore be conceived as something different from labor itself. Then, however, the world of commodities is divided into two great categories. On one side, labor power, on the other side, commodities themselves. The materialization, etc. of labor is, however, not to be taken in such a Scottish sense as Adam Smith conceives it. When we speak of the commodity as a materialization of labor, in the sense of its exchange value, this itself is only an imaginary, that is to say, a purely social mode of existence of the commodity, which has nothing to do with its corporeal reality. It is conceived as a definite quantity of social labor, or of money. It may be that the concrete labor whose result it is leaves no trace in it. In manufactured commodities, this trace remains in the outward form given to the raw material. In agriculture, etc., although the form given to the commodity, for example wheat or oxen and so on, is also the product of human labor, and indeed of labor transmitted and added to from generation to generation, yet this is not evident in the product. In other forms of industrial labor, the purpose of the labor is not at all to alter the form of the thing, but only its position. For example, when a commodity is brought from China to England, etc., no trace of the labor involved can be seen in the thing itself, except for those who call to mind that it is not an English product. Therefore, the materialization of labor in the commodity must not be understood in that way. The mystification here arises from the fact that a social relation appears in the form of a thing. It remains true, however, that the commodity appears as past objectified labor, and that therefore, if it does not appear in the form of a thing, it can only appear in the form of labor power itself, but never directly as living labor itself, except only in a roundabout way which, in practice, seems the same, but whose significance lies in the determination of different rates of wages. Productive labor would therefore be such labor as produces commodities, or directly produces, trains, develops, maintains, or reproduces labor power itself. Adam Smith excludes the latter from his category productive labor, arbitrarily, but with a certain correct instinct, that if he included it, this would open the floodgates for false pretensions to the title of productive labor. Insofar, therefore, as we leave labor power itself out of account, productive labor is labor which produces commodities, material products, whose production has cost a definite quantity of labor or labor time. These material products include all products of art and science, books, paintings, statues, etc., insofar as they take the form of things. In addition, however, the product of labor must be a commodity in the sense of being some vendible commodity, that is to say, a commodity in its first form, which has still to pass through its metamorphosis. A manufacturer may himself construct a machine if he cannot get one built anywhere else, not to sell it, but to make use of it as a use value. However, he then wears it out as a part of his constant capital, and so sells it piecemeal in the form of the product which it has helped to make. Certain labors of menial servants may therefore equally well take the form of potential commodities, and even of the same use values considered as material objects. But they are not productive labor, because in fact they produce not commodities but immediate use values. As for labors which are productive for their purchaser or employer himself, as for example the actor's labor for the theatrical entrepreneur, the fact that their purchaser cannot sell them to the public in the form of commodities, but only in the form of the action itself, would show that they are unproductive labors. Apart from such cases, productive labor is such as produces commodities, and unproductive labor is such as produces personal services. The former labor is represented in a vendible thing. The latter must be consumed while it is being performed. The former includes, except for that labor which creates labor power itself, all material and intellectual wealth, meat as well as books, all that exists in the form of things. The latter covers all labor which satisfy any imaginary or real need of the individual, or even those which are forced upon the individual against his will. The commodity is the most elementary form of bourgeois wealth. The explanation of productive labor as labor which produces commodities also corresponds, therefore, to a much more elementary point of view than that which defines productive labor as labor which produces capital. Adam Smith's opponents have disregarded his first pertinent definition and instead have concentrated on the second, pointing out the unavoidable contradictions and inconsistencies to which it gives rise. And their attacks were made all the easier for them by their insistence on the material content of the labor, and particularly the specific requirement that the labor must fix itself in a more or less permanent product. We shall see in a moment what it was that particularly gave rise to the polemics. But first, this further point. Adam Smith says of the physiocratic system that its great merit is that it represented the wealth of nations as consisting, quote, not in the unconsumable riches of money, but in the consumable goods annually produced by the labor of the society, end quote. Here, we have a deduction of his second definition of productive labor. The definition of surplus value naturally depended on the form in which value itself was conceived. In the monetary and mercantile systems, it is therefore presented as money, by the physiocrats as the produce of the land, as agricultural product, finally, in Adam Smith's writings as commodity in general. Insofar as the physiocrats touch upon the substance of value, they resolve it entirely into pure use value, matter, corporeal object, just as the mercantilists resolve it into the pure form of value, the form in which the product makes itself manifest as general social labor, that is, money. With Adam Smith, both conditions of the commodity, use value and exchange value, are combined, and so all labor is productive, which manifests itself in any use value, any useful product. That it is labor that manifests itself in the product already implies that the product is equal to a definite quantity of general social labor. As against the physiocrats, Adam Smith reestablishes the value of the product as the essential basis of bourgeois wealth. But on the other hand, he divests value of the purely fantastic form, that of gold and silver, in which it appeared to the mercantilists. Every commodity is in itself money. It must be recognized that at the same time, Adam Smith also falls back more or less into the mercantilist conception of permanency, in fact, inconsumability. We can recall the passage in Petty, see the first volume where I quote from Petty's Political Arithmetic, where wealth is valued according to the degrees in which it is imperishable, more or less permanent, and finally, gold and silver are set above all other things as wealth that is not perishable. Adolphe Blanqui, in the History of Political Economy, says of Adam Smith, quote, in restricting the sphere of wealth exclusively to those values which are embodied in material substances, he erased from the book of production the whole boundless mass of immaterial values, daughters of the moral capital of civilized nations, etc. Section 5. Vulgarization of bourgeois political economy in the definition of productive labor. The polemics against Adam Smith's distinction between productive and unproductive labor were for the most part confined to the de minorum gentium, among whom, moreover, Stork was the most important. They are not to be found in the work of any economist of significance, of anyone of whom it can be said that he made some discovery in political economy. They are, however, the hobby horse of the second-rate fellows, and especially of the schoolmasterish compilers and writers of compendia, as well as of dilettantes with facile pens and vulgarizers in this field. What particularly aroused these polemics against Adam Smith was the following circumstance. The great mass of the so-called higher-grade workers, such as state officials, military people, artists, doctors, priests, judges, lawyers, etc., some of whom are not only not productive, but in essence destructive, but who know how to appropriate to themselves a very great part of the material wealth, partly through the sale of their immaterial commodities, and partly by forcibly imposing the latter upon other people, found it not at all pleasant to be relegated economically to the same class as clowns and menial servants, and to appear merely as people partaking in the consumption, parasites on the actual producers, or rather agents of production. This was a peculiar profanation precisely of those functions which had hitherto been surrounded with a halo and had enjoyed superstitious veneration. Political economy in its classical period, like the bourgeoisie itself in its upstart period, adopted a severely critical attitude to the machinery of the state, etc. At a later stage, it realized, and as was shown too in practice, learned from experience that the necessity for the inherited social combination of all these classes, which were in part totally unproductive, arose from its own organization. Insofar as those unproductive laborers do not produce entertainment, so that their purchase entirely depends on how the agent of production cares to spend his wages or his profit, insofar, on the contrary, as they are necessary, or make themselves necessary because of physical infirmities, like doctors, or spiritual weakness, like parsons, or because of the conflict between private interests and national interests, like statesmen, all lawyers, police, and soldiers, they are regarded by Adam Smith, as by the industrial capitalists themselves and the working class, as incidental expenses of production, which are therefore to be cut down to the most indispensable minimum and provided as cheaply as possible. Bourgeois society reproduces in its own form everything against which it had fought in feudal or absolutist form. In the first place, therefore, it becomes a principal task for the sycophants of the society, and especially of the upper classes, to restore, in theoretical terms, even the purely parasitic section of these unproductive laborers, or to justify the exaggerated claims of the section which is indispensable. The dependence of the ideological etc. classes on the capitalists was in fact proclaimed. Secondly, however, a section of the agents of production, that is, of material production itself, were declared by one group of economists or another to be unproductive. For example, the landowner by those among the economists who represented industrial capital, see Ricardo. Others, for example Carey, declared that the merchant, in the true sense of the word, was an unproductive laborer. Then, even a third group came along who declared that the capitalists themselves were unproductive, or who at least sought to reduce their claims to material wealth to wages, that is, to the wages of a productive laborer. Many intellectual workers seemed inclined to share the skepticism in regard to the capitalist. It was therefore time to make a compromise and to recognize the productivity of all classes not directly included among the agents of material production. One good turn deserves another, and, as in the fable of the bees, it had to be established that even from the productive economic standpoint, the bourgeois world, with all its unproductive laborers, is the best of all worlds. This was all the more necessary because the unproductive laborers, on their part, were advancing critical observations in regard to the productivity of the classes who, in general, were those born to consume the fruits, or in regard to those agents of production, like landowners, who do nothing at all, etc. Both the do-nothings and their parasites had to be found a place in this best possible order of things. Thirdly, as the dominion of capital extended, and in fact those spheres of production not directly related to the production of material wealth became also more and more dependent on it, especially when the positive science, that is natural sciences, were subordinated to it as serving material production, the sycophantic underlings of political economy felt it their duty to glorify and justify every sphere of activity by demonstrating that it was linked with the production of material wealth, that it was a means towards it, and they honored everyone by making him a productive laborer in the primary sense. Namely, a laborer who labors in the service of capital, who is useful in one way or another to the enrichment of the capitalist, etc. In this matter, even such people as Malthus are to be preferred, who directly defend the necessity and usefulness of unproductive laborers and pure parasites. Section 6. Advocates of Smith's views on productive labor, on the history of the subject. Subsection A. Advocates of the first view, Ricardo and Sismondi. It is not worth the trouble to examine in detail the inanities of Germain Garnier, the Earl of Lauderdale, Brougham, Say, Stork, and later Senior, Lossy, and so on, in regard to this question. We shall cite only a few characteristic passages. But first, a passage from Ricardo, in which he shows that it is much more advantageous for the productive laborers when the owners of surplus value, profit and rent, consume it in unproductive laborers, as menial servants for instance, than in luxury products produced by the productive laborers. Sismondi accepts the correct statement of Smith's distinction, as also, of course, does Ricardo. The real distinction between productive and unproductive classes is, quote, the one always exchanges its labor against the capital of a nation, the other always exchanges it against a part of the national revenue. Sismondi, likewise following Adam Smith on surplus value, says, quote, although the laborer, by his daily labor, may have produced much more than his daily outlay, after sharing with the landowner and the capitalist, what remains for him is seldom much beyond what is strictly necessary for his existence. Ricardo says, if a landlord or a capitalist expends his revenue in the manner of an ancient baron, in the support of a great number of retainers or menial servants, he will give employment to much more labor than if he expended it on fine clothes or costly furniture, on carriages, on horses, or in the purchase of any other luxuries. In both cases, the net revenue would be the same, and so would the gross revenue, but the former would be realized in different commodities. If my revenue were 10,000, the same quantity nearly of productive labor would be employed, whether I realized it in fine clothes and costly furniture, etc., or in a quantity of food and clothing of the same value. If, however, I realized my revenue in the first set of commodities, no more labor would be consequently employed. I should enjoy my furniture and my clothes, and there would be an end of them. But if I realized my revenue in food and clothing, and my desire was to employ menial servants, all those whom I could do so employ, with my revenue of 10,000, or with the food and clothing which it would purchase, would be added to the former demand for laborers, and this addition would take place only because I chose this mode of expending my revenue. As the laborers, then, are interested in the demand for labor, they must naturally desire that as much of the revenue as possible should be diverted from expenditures on luxuries to be expended in the support of menial servants. Subsection B. Early attempts to distinguish between productive and unproductive labor, Davenant and Petty. Davenant quotes from an old statistician, Gregory King, a list entitled Scheme of the Income and Expense of Several Families of England, calculated for the year 1688. In this, the erudite King divides the whole nation into two main classes, quote, increasing the wealth of the kingdom, 2.7 million heads, and decreasing the wealth of the kingdom, 2.8 million heads. Thus, the former is the productive class, the latter the unproductive. The productive class consists of lords, baronets, knights, esquires, gentlemen, persons in office and places, merchants in oversea trade, persons in the law, clergymen, freeholders, farmers, persons in liberal arts and sciences, shopkeepers and tradesmen, artisans and handicrafts, naval officers and military officers. As against these, the unproductive class consists of common seamen, laboring people and outservants, these are agricultural laborers and day-wage laborers in manufacture, cottagers, who in Davenant's time were still a fifth of the total English population, common soldiers, paupers, gypsies, thieves, beggars, and vagrants generally. Davenant explains this list of ranks prepared by the learned King as follows, by which he means that the first class of the people, from land, arts, and industry, maintain themselves, and add every year something to the nation's general stock, and besides this, out of their superfluity, contribute every year so much to the maintenance of others. That of the second class, some partly maintain themselves by labor, but that the rest, as most of the wives and children of these, are nourished at the cost of others, and are a yearly burden to the public, consuming annually so much as would be otherwise added to the nation's general stock. In addition to this, the following passage from Davenant is rather characteristic of the views of the mercantilists on surplus value. It is the exportation of our own product that must make England rich. To be gainers in the balance of trade, we must carry out of our own product what will purchase the things of foreign growth that are needful for our own consumption, with some overplus either in bullion or goods to be sold in other countries, which overplus is the profit a nation makes by trade, and that is more or less according to the natural frugality of the people that export, a frugality which the Dutch have but not the English. Or as from the low price of labor and manufacture, they can afford the commodity cheap and at a rate not to be undersold in foreign markets. By what is consumed at home, one loses only what another gets, and the nation in general is not at all richer, but all foreign consumption is a clear and certain profit. Incidentally, it must not be thought that these mercantilists were as stupid as they were made out to be by the later vulgar free traders. In Volume 2 of his Discourses on the Public Revenues and on the Trade of England, etc., published in London in 1698, Davenant says, among other things, "Gold and silver are indeed the measure of trade, but the spring and original of it in all nations is the natural or artificial product of the country, that is to say, what their land or what their labor and industry produces. And this is so true that a nation may be supposed by some accident quite without the species of money, and yet if the people are numerous, industrious, versed in traffic, skilled in sea affairs, and if they have good ports and a soil fertile in variety of commodities, such a people will have trade, and they shall quickly get among them a plenty of gold and silver, so that the real and effective riches of a country is its native product. Gold and silver are so far from being the only things that deserve the name of treasure, or the riches of a nation, that in truth, money is, at bottom, no more than the countries with which men in their dealings have been accustomed to reckon. We understand that to be wealth which maintains the prince and the general body of his people in plenty, ease, and safety. We esteem that to be treasure which for the use of man has been converted from gold and silver into buildings and improvements of the country, as also other things convertible into those metals, as the fruits of the earth, manufactures or foreign commodities and stock of shipping, even perishable goods, may be held the riches of a nation, if they are convertible, though not converted, into gold and silver. And this, we believe, does not only hold between man and man, but between one country and another. The common people, being the stomach of the body politic, that stomach in Spain did not take the money as it should have done, and failed to digest it. Trade and manufactures are the only mediums by which such a digestion and distribution of gold and silver can be made, as will be nutritive to the body politic. Moreover, Petty too had the conception of productive laborers, though he also includes soldiers. Husbandmen, seamen, soldiers, artisans, and merchants are the very pillars of any commonwealth. All the other great professions rise out of the infirmities and miscarriages of these. Now the seaman is three of these four, that is, navigator, merchant, and soldier. The labor of the seaman and freight of ships is always of the nature of an exported commodity, the overplus whereof, above what is imported, brings home money, etc. In this connection, William Petty also explains the advantages of the division of labor. Those who have the command of sea trade may work at easier freight with more profit than others at greater, higher freight charges. So those who command the trade of shipping can build different sorts of vessels for different purposes. One sort of vessels for the turbulent sea, another for inland waters and rivers, one sort for war, another for burden, etc. And this is the chief of several reasons why the Hollanders can go with less freight than their neighbors, that is, because they can afford a particular sort of vessels for each particular trade. Here, too, Petty strikes quite a Smithian tone when he continues, "If taxes are taken from the industrialists, etc., in order to give money to those who in general are occupied in ways which produce no material thing, or things of real use and value in the commonwealth, in this case, the wealth of the public will be diminished, otherwise than as such exercises are recreations and refreshments of the mind, and which being moderately used, do qualify and dispose men to what in itself is more considerable. After computing how many people are needed for industrial work, the remainder may safely and without possible prejudice to the commonwealth be employed in the arts and exercises of pleasure and ornament, the greatest whereof is the improvement of natural knowledge. There is much more to be gained by manufacture than husbandry, and by merchandise than manufacture. A seaman is in effect 3 husbandmen." In one passage of Petty's, there can be seen an anticipation of the nature of surplus value, although he treats it only in the form of rent, especially when it is put alongside the following passage, in which he determines the relative value of silver and corn by the relative quantities of each that can be produced in the same labor time. If a man can bring to London an ounce of silver out of the earth in Peru, in the same time that he can produce a bushel of corn, then one is the natural price of the other. Now if by reason of new and easier mines, a man can get 2 ounces of silver as easily as formerly he did 1, then corn will be as cheap at 10 shillings a bushel, as before it was 5 shillings. Let 100 men work 10 years upon corn, and the same number of men the same time upon silver. I say that the net proceed of the silver is the price of the whole net proceed of the corn, and like parts of the one, the price of like parts of the other. Corn will be twice as dear where there are 200 husbandmen to do the same work which 100 could perform. The passages to which I alluded above are the following. As trades and curious arts increase, so the trade of husbandry will decrease, or else the wages of husbandmen must rise, and consequently the rents of lands must fall. If trade and manufacture have increased in England, if a greater part of the people apply themselves to those faculties than there did heretofore, and if the price of corn be no greater now than when husbandmen were more numerous and the tradesmen fewer, it follows from that single reason that the rents of land must fall. As, for example, suppose the price of wheat be 5 shillings or 60 pence the bushel. Now, if the rent of the land whereon it grows be the third sheaf, then of the 60 pence, 20 pence is for the land, and 40 pence for the husbandman. But if the husbandman's wages should rise 1/8 part, or from 8 pence to 9 pence per diem, then the husbandman's share in the bushel of wheat rises from 40 pence to 45 pence, and consequently, the rent of the land must fall from 20 pence to 15 pence, for we suppose the price of the wheat still remains the same, especially since we cannot raise it, for if we did attempt it, corn would be brought into us, as into Holland, from foreign parts, where the state of husbandry was not changed. The following passage, where rent in general is treated as a surplus value, a net product, should be compared with the one quoted above from Petty. Suppose a man could, with his own hands, plant a certain scope of land with corn, that is, could dig or plow, harrow, weed, reap, carry home, thresh, and winnow so much as the husbandry of this land required. I say that when this man has deducted his seed out of the proceed of his harvest, and also what himself has both eaten and given to others in exchange for clothes and other natural necessaries, that the remainder of corn is the natural and true rent of the land for that year, and the medium of 7 years, or rather of so many years as makes up the cycle, within which dearths and plenties make their revolution, doth give the ordinary rent of the land in corn. But a further, though collateral question may be, how much English money this corn or rent is worth? I answer, so much as the money which another single man can save within the same time over and above his expense, if he employed himself wholly to produce and make it. Let another man go travel into a country where is silver, and there dig it, refine it, bring it to the same place where the other man planted his corn, coin it, etc., the same person, all the while of his working for silver, gathering also food for his necessary livelihood, and procuring himself covering, etc. I say, the silver of the one must be esteemed of equal value with the corn of the other. Subsection C. John Stuart Mill, an adherent of Smith's second view of productive labor. Mr. John Stuart Mill, in Essays on Some Unsettled Questions of Political Economy, published in London in 1844, also struggled with the problem of productive and unproductive labor, but in so doing, he in fact added nothing to Smith's second definition except that labors which produce labor power itself are also productive. Quote, sources of enjoyment may be accumulated and stored up. Enjoyment itself cannot. The wealth of a country consists of the sum total of the permanent sources of enjoyment, whether material or immaterial, contained in it, and labor or expenditure which tends to augment or keep up these permanent sources should, we conceive, be termed productive. If the mechanic who made the spinning jenny labored productively, the spinner also labored productively when he was learning his trade, and what they both consumed productively, that is to say, its consumption did not tend to diminish, but to increase the sum of the permanent sources of enjoyment in the country by effecting a new creation of those sources, more than equal to the amount of the consumption. We will now briefly run over the twaddle written against Adam Smith in connection with productive and unproductive labor. Section 7. Germain Garnier. Vulgarization of the theories put forward by Smith and the physiocrats. On productive labor, in the highest sense, Garnier shares the view of the physiocrats. He only makes it somewhat weaker. He opposes Smith's view that productive labor is that which realizes itself in some particular subject or vendible commodity, which lasts for some time at least after that labor is past. Subsection A. Confusion of labor which is exchanged against capital with labor exchanged against revenue. The false conception that the total capital is replaced through the revenue of the consumers. Germain Garnier brings forward various arguments against Adam Smith, which are in part repeated by later authors. First, quote, this distinction is false, inasmuch as it is based on a difference which does not exist. All labor is productive in the sense in which the author uses the word productive. The labor of the one, as of the other of these two classes, is equally productive of some enjoyment, commodity, or utility for the person who pays for it. Otherwise, this labor would not find wages. It is therefore productive because it produces some use value, and is sold, has an exchange value, and is thus itself a commodity. In developing this point, however, Garnier cites examples by way of illustration, in which the unproductive laborers do the same thing, produce the same use value, or the same kind of use value as the productive. For example, quote, the servant who is in my service, who lights my fire, who dresses my hair, who cleans and keeps in order my clothes and my furniture, who prepares my food, etc., performs services absolutely of the same kind as the laundress or the seamstress who cleans and keeps in order her customers' linen, as the eating-house keeper, cook-shop proprietor, or publican who carries on his trade of preparing food for persons whom it suits better to come and dine with him, as the barber, the hairdresser. For Adam Smith, however, most of these people are as little reckoned among productive workers as their servants, who perform immediate services, finally as the mason, the tiller, the joiner, the glazier, the stove setter, etc., and the multitude of building laborers who come when they are called to carry out restorations and repairs, and whose annual income depends as much on simple repair and maintenance work as on a new construction. Adam Smith nowhere says that the labor which fixes itself in a more or less permanent object cannot be equally well repairs as the making of new things. This kind of labor consists less in producing than in maintaining. Its aim is less to add to the value of the subjects to which it is applied than to prevent their decay. All these laborers, including their servants, so ye the person who pays them the labor of maintaining his own things, they can therefore be regarded as machines for maintaining value, or rather, use values. Destutt de Tracy also asserts this view of the saving of labor. See further on. The unproductive labor of one does not become productive by saving the other unproductive labor. One of the two performs it. A part of Adam Smith's unproductive labor, but only the part which is absolutely necessary in order to consume things, which, so to speak, belongs to the costs of consumption, and then too only when it saves this time for a productive worker, becomes necessary as a result of the division of labor. But Adam Smith does not deny this division of labor. If everyone had to perform productive and unproductive labor, and through the dividing up of these kinds of labor between two persons, both were better performed, according to Adam Smith, this would in no way alter the circumstance that one of these labors is productive and the other unproductive. It is for that, and for that alone, that they most often labor. For one person to save the labor of looking after himself, 10 have to look after him. A curious way of saving labor. Besides, unproductive labor of this kind is most often made use of by those who do nothing. Thus, either they are all productive, or none of them is productive. Secondly, a Frenchman cannot forget the bridges and roadways. Why, he says, call productive, quote, the labor of an inspector or director of a private enterprise in trade or manufacture, and non-productive the labor of the government official, who, watching over the upkeep of public highways, of navigable canals and ports, of monies and other important instruments destined to enliven commercial activity, watching over the security of transport and communications, the carrying out of conventions, etc., who can with justice be regarded as the inspector of the great social manufacture. It is labor of absolutely the same nature, though on a vaster scale. Insofar as such a person takes part in the production, or conservation and reproduction of material things, which could be sold where they were not in the hands of the state, Smith might call his labor productive. Inspectors of the great social manufacture are purely French creations. Thirdly, here Garnier falls into moralizing. Why should, quote, the manufacturer of perfumery, who flatters my sense of smell, be productive, and not the musician, who enchants my ear? Smith would reply, because the former supplies a material product, and the latter does not. Morals and the merits of the two workers have nothing to do with the distinction. Fourthly, is it not a contradiction that, quote, the violin maker, the organ builder, and the music dealer, the mechanic, etc. are productive, and the professions for which these labors are only preparations are unproductive? All of them have, as the final aim of their labor, a consumption of the same kind. If the result which some of them have in view does not deserve to be counted among the products of the labor of society, why should one treat more favorably what is nothing but a means for attaining this result? On this reasoning, a man who eats corn is just as productive as a man who produces it. For with what aim is corn produced? In order to eat it. So if the labor of eating is not productive, why should the labor of cultivating corn be productive, since it is only a means for attaining the same? Besides, the man who eats produces brain, muscles, etc., and are these not just as worthy products as barley or wheat? An indignant friend of humanity might ask Adam Smith. In the first place, Adam Smith does not deny that the unproductive laborer produces a product of some sort. Otherwise, he would not be a laborer at all. Secondly, it may seem strange that the doctor who prescribes pills is not a productive laborer, and yet the apothecary who makes them up is. Similarly, the instrument maker who makes the fiddle but not the musician who plays it. But that would only show that productive laborers produce products which have no purpose except to serve as means of production for unproductive laborers, which, however, is no more surprising than that all productive laborers, when all is said and done, produce firstly the means for the payment of unproductive laborers, and secondly, products which are consumed by those who do not perform any labor. Of all these comments, number 2 is that of a Frenchman who can't forget his bridges and roadways. Number 3 amounts only to morals. Number 4 either contains the stupidity that consumption is just as productive as production, which is not true in bourgeois society, where one produces and another consumes, or that some productive labor merely produces the material for unproductive labor, which Adam Smith nowhere denies. Only number 1 contains the correct point that Adam Smith, by his second definition, calls the same kinds of labor productive and unproductive, or rather that according to his own definition, he would have to call a relatively small part of his unproductive labor productive. A point, therefore, that does not tell against the distinction, but against the subsumption of certain activities under the distinction, or the way this distinction is applied. After making all these comments, the learned Garnier finally comes to the point. The only general difference that can, it seems, be observed between the two classes assumed by Smith is that in the class which he calls productive, there is, or may always be, some intermediary person between the maker of the object and the person who consumes it, whereas in the labor that he calls non-productive, there cannot be any intermediary, and the relation between the laborer and the consumer is necessarily direct and immediate. It is evident that there is necessarily a direct and immediate relation between the person who uses the experience of the physician, the skill of the surgeon, the knowledge of the lawyer, the talent of the musician or actor, or finally the services of the domestic servant, and each of these different hired workers at the moment of their labor, while in the profession constituting the other class, the thing to be consumed being material and palpable, it can be the subject of many intermediary exchanges after leaving the person who makes it before it reaches the one who consumes it. In these last words, Garnier shows, in spite of himself, the concealed association of ideas that exist between Smith's first distinction, labor which is exchanged against capital, and labor which is exchanged against revenue, and his second, labor which fixes itself in a material vendible commodity, and labor which does not so fix itself. The latter, by its nature, cannot for the most part be subordinated to the capitalist mode of production. The former can. To say nothing of the fact that on the basis of capitalist production, where the great majority of material commodities, material and palpable things, is produced by wage laborers under the domination of capital, unproductive labors, or services, whether those of a prostitute or of the Pope, can only be paid for either out of the wages of the productive laborers or out of the profits of their employers, and the partners in those profits, quite apart from the circumstances that those productive laborers produce the material basis of the subsistence, and consequently the existence of the unproductive laborers. It is, however, characteristic of this shallow French dog that he, who wants to be an expert in political economy, and so an explorer of capitalist production, considers inessential the feature which makes this production capitalist, the exchange of capital for wage labor, instead of the direct exchange of revenue for wage labor, or the revenue which the laborer directly pays to himself. By so doing, Garnier makes capitalist production itself an inessential form instead of a necessary, though only historically, that is transiently necessary, form for the development of the social productive powers of labor, and the transformation of labor into social labor. It would also always be necessary to deduct from his productive class all laborers whose labor consists purely of cleaning, conserving, or repairing finished articles, and consequently does not put any new product into circulation. Smith nowhere says that the labor or its product must enter the circulating capital. It can enter directly into fixed capital, like the mechanic's labor repairing a machine in a factory. But in this case, its value enters into the circulation of the product, the commodity, and the repairers, etc., who do this labor as servants do not exchange their labor against capital, but against revenue. It is in consequence of this difference that the non-productive class, as Smith has observed, subsists only on revenues. In fact, since this class allows of no intermediary between itself and the consumer of its products, that is to say, the person who enjoys its labor, it is paid immediately by the consumer, and he pays only from revenues. As against these, the laborers of the productive class, being as a rule paid by an intermediary who intends to make a profit from their labor, are most often paid by capital. But this capital is always in the end replaced by the revenue of a consumer, otherwise it would not circulate, and therefore would not yield any profit to its possessor. This last but is quite childish. In the first place, a part of the capital is replaced by capital, and not by revenue, whether this part of the capital circulates or does not circulate. Subsection B. Replacement of the constant capital by means of the exchange of capital against capital. When a coal mine supplies coal to an ironworks, and gets from the latter iron which enters into the operations of the coal mine as means of production, the coal is in this way exchanged for capital to the amount of the value of this iron, and reciprocally the iron, to the amount of its own value, is exchanged as capital for coal. Both, considered as use values, are products of new labor, although this labor was produced with means of labor that were already in existence. But the value of the product of the year's labor is not the product of the labor newly added in the year. It also replaces the value of the past labor which was materialized in the means of production. Therefore, the part of the total product which is equal to this value is not a part of the product of the year's labor, but the reproduction of past labor. Let us take, for example, the product of the daily labor of a coal mine, an ironworks, a timber producer, and a machine-building factory. Let the constant capital in all these industries be equal to 1/3 of all the component parts of value of the product. That is, let the proportion of pre-existing labor to living labor be 1:2. Then, let all these industries produce each a daily product of X, X prime, X prime prime, X prime prime prime. These products are certain quantities of coal, iron, timber, and machinery. As such products, they are products of the day's labor, but also of the daily consumed raw materials, fuel, machinery, etc., which have all contributed to the day's production. Let the values of these be equal to Z, Z prime, Z prime prime, and Z prime prime prime. These values are not the product of the day's labor, since Z over 3, Z prime over 3, etc. are only equal to the value which the constant elements of Z, Z prime, etc. had before they entered into the day's labor. Therefore, also X over 3, X prime over 3, etc., or a third part of the use values produced, represents only the value of the pre-existing labor, and continually replace it. The exchange which here takes place between pre-existing labor and the product of living labor is of quite a different nature from the exchange between labor power and the conditions of labor existing as capital. X equals Z, yet Z is the value of the total X, but 1/3 of Z is equal to the value of the raw material, etc. contained in the total X. thus is a part of the day's product of the labor, but not all the product of the day's labor, but on the contrary of the previous pre-existing labor combined with it, in which the pre-existing labor combined with the day's labor reappears and is replaced. Now it is true that each aliquot part of X, which is simply the quantity of actual products, iron, coal, etc., represents in its value 1/3 pre-existing labor and 2/3 labor performed or added the same day. Pre-existing labor and the day's labor enter into the total product in the same proportion as they enter into each separate product, of which the total product is made up. But if I divide the total product into two parts, putting 1/3 on one side and 2/3 on the other, it is the same as if the 1/3 represents only pre-existing labor and the other 2/3 only the labor of the day. In fact, the first third represents all past labor which entered into the total product, the full value of the means of production consumed. After deducting this 1/3, therefore, the other 2/3 can represent only the product of the day's labor. The 2/3, in fact, represent the total amount of the day's labor that was added to the means of production. The last 2/3 are therefore equal to the producer's revenue, profit and wages. He can consume them, that is, spend them on articles which enter into his individual consumption. Suppose that these 2/3 of the coal produced daily were bought by the consumers or purchasers not with money, but with the commodities which they have previously transformed into money in order to buy the coal with it. A part of these 2/3 of the coal will enter into the individual consumption of the coal producers themselves for heating, etc. This part, therefore, does not enter into circulation, or if it does first enter into circulation, it'll be withdrawn again from it by its own producers. Minus this part of the 2/3, which the producers of coal themselves consume, they must exchange all the rest of it, if they want to consume it, for articles which enter into individual consumption. In this exchange, it is a matter of complete indifference to them whether the sellers of the consumable articles exchange capital or revenue for the coal. That is to say, whether, for example, the cloth manufacturer exchanges his cloth for coal in order to heat his private dwelling. In this case, the coal itself, in turn, is an article of consumption for him, and he pays for it with revenue, with a quantity of cloth that represents profit, or whether James, the cloth manufacturer's footman, exchanges the cloth he has received as wages for the coal. In this case, the latter is once more an article of consumption in exchange for the revenue of the cloth manufacturer, who in turn, however, has exchanged his revenue for the unproductive labor of the footman, or whether the cloth manufacturer exchanges cloth for coal in order to replace the coal required in his factory that has been used up. In the latter case, the cloth that the cloth manufacturer exchanges represents for him constant capital, the value of one of his means of production, and the coal represents for him not only the value, but his means of production in kind. But for the coal producer, the cloth is an article of consumption, and both cloth and coal represent for him revenue. The coal, revenue in its non-realized form, the cloth, revenue in its realized form. But as for the last 1/3 of the coal producer cannot spend it on articles which enter into his individual consumption. He cannot spend it as revenue. It belongs to the process of production, or reproduction, and must be transformed into iron, timber, machinery, into articles which form the component parts of his constant capital, and without which the production of coal cannot be renewed or continued. He could, it is true, exchange also this 1/3 for articles of consumption, or what is the same thing, for money of the producers of these articles, but in fact only on the condition that he exchanges these consumption articles in turn for iron, timber, machinery, that they enter neither into his own consumption nor into the outlay of his revenue, but into the consumption and revenue outlays of the producers of timber, iron, and machinery, all of whom, however, in turn find themselves in the position of not being able to expend 1/3 of their product on articles for individual consumption. Now let us assume that coal enters into the constant capital of the producers of iron and timber, and of the machine builder. On the other hand, iron, timber, and machinery enter into the constant capital of the producer of coal. Insofar as these products of theirs enter into their mutual constant capital to the same amount of value, they replace themselves in kind, and one has to pay the other only the balance for the surplus that he has bought from him in excess of what he has sold to him. In fact, in such a transaction, money appears in practice, through the medium of bills of exchange, etc., only as means of payment, not as coin, means of circulation, and only the balance is paid in money. The producer of coal will need a part of this 1/3 of his coal for his own reproduction, just as he deducted from the product a part of the 2/3 for his own consumption. The whole quantity of coal, iron, timber, and machinery, which are reciprocally replaced in this way by the exchange of constant capital for constant capital, of constant capital in one natural form for constant capital in another natural form, has absolutely nothing to do either with the exchange of revenue for constant capital or with the exchange of revenue for revenue. It plays exactly the same role as seed in agriculture, or the capital stock of cattle in cattle rearing. It is a part of the yearly product of labor, but it is not a part of the product of the year's newly added labor. On the contrary, it is a part of the product of the year's labor plus the pre-existing labor, which, conditions of production remaining the same, replaces itself annually as means of production, as constant capital, without entering into any circulation other than that between dealers and dealers, and without affecting the value of the part of the product which enters into the circulation between dealers and consumers. Let us assume that the whole 1/3 of the coal is thus exchanged in kind for its own elements of production, iron, timber, and machinery. It might be possible, for example, to exchange the entire amount direct for machinery, but the machine builder in turn would exchange it as constant capital, not only for his own, but for that of the producers of iron and timber. In fact, each hundredweight of the 2/3 of his product in coal, which he exchanged for articles of consumption, exchanged as revenue, would, from the standpoint of value, consist of two parts. as the total product does. 1/3 of a hundredweight would be equal to the value of the means of production used up in the hundredweight, and 2/3 of it would be equal to the labor newly added to this third by the producers of the coal. But if the total product is, for example, equal to 30,000 hundredweights, he exchanges only 20,000 as revenue. On the assumptions made, the other 10,000 would be replaced by iron, timber, machinery, etc., etc. In a word, the whole value of the means of production used up in the 30,000 hundredweights would be replaced in kind by means of production of the same sort and of equal value. The buyers of the 20,000 hundredweights thus do not pay a single farthing for the value of the pre-existing labor contained in the 20,000 hundredweights, for the 20,000 represents only 2/3 of the value of the total product in which the newly added labor is realized. It comes to the same thing, therefore, as if the 20,000 represented only labor newly added, during the year, for example, and no pre-existing labor. The buyer therefore pays the whole value of each hundredweight, pre-existing labor plus newly added labor, and yet only pays for the newly added labor, and that is because the quantity he buys is only 20,000 hundredweights, only that quantity of the total product which is equal to the value of all the newly added labor. Just as little does he pay for the farmer's seed in paying for the wheat which he eats. The producers have mutually replaced this part for each other, therefore they do not need to have it replaced a second time. They have replaced it with the part of their own product, which, it is true, is the year's product of their labor, but is not at all the product of their year's labor, but on the contrary, is the part of their annual product that represents the pre-existing labor. Without the new labor, the product would not be there, but in the same way it would not be there without the labor materialized in the means of production. If it were merely the product of the new labor, then its value would be less than it now is, and there would be no part of the product to be returned to production. But if the other method of labor, that is using means of production, were not more productive and did not yield more product in spite of a part of the product having to be returned to production, it would not be used. Although no part of the value of the 1/3 of the coal enters into the 20,000 hundredweights sold as revenue, any change in the value of the constant capital, which the 1/3 or 10,000 hundredweights represented, would nevertheless bring about a change of value in the other 2/3 which are sold as revenue. Let production in iron, timber, and machinery, in a word, in the elements of production of which the 1/3 of the product is composed, become more costly. Let the productivity of mining labor remain the same. The 30,000 hundredweights are produced with the same quantity of iron, timber, coal, machinery, and labor as before. But since iron, timber, and machinery have gotten dearer, cost more labor time than before, more coal than before must be given for them. As previously, the product would be equal to 30,000 hundredweights. The coal mining labor has remained as productive as it was before. With the same quantity of living labor and the same amount of timber, iron, machinery, etc., it produces the same 30,000 hundredweights as before. The living labor, as before, is represented by the same value, say 20,000 pounds reckoned in money. On the other hand, timber, iron, etc., in a word, the constant capital, now cost 16,000 instead of 10,000. That is to say, the labor time contained in them has increased by 6/10, or 60%. The value of the total product is now equal to 36,000 pounds. It was 30,000 pounds before. It has therefore risen by 1/5, or 20%. So also, every aliquot part of the product costs 1/5, or 20%, more than before. If a hundredweight cost £1 previously, then now it costs £1 plus 1/5 of £1, i.e. £1 4 shillings. Previously, 1/3 of the total product was equal to constant capital, 2/3 equal to the labor added. Now the proportion of the constant capital to the value of the total product is 16,000 to 36,000, or 16 to 36, or 4/9. It amounts therefore to 1/9 of the value of the total product more than before. The part of the product which is equal to the value of the labor added was formerly 2/3, or 6/9 of the product. It is now 5/9. The coal miners' labor would not have become less productive, but the product of their labor plus the pre-existing labor would have become less productive. That is, 1/9 more of the total product would be required to replace the component part of the value formed by the constant capital. 1/9 less of the product would be equal to the value of the labor added. Now, as before, the producers of iron, timber, etc. would only pay for 10,000 centium weights of coal. Previously, these cost them 10,000 pounds. They will now cost them 12,000. A part of the cost of the constant capital would therefore be made good, since they would have to pay the increased price for the part of the coal which they get in replacement for iron, etc. But the producer of coal has to buy raw material, etc. from them to the amount of 16,000 pounds. There remains, therefore, a debit balance of 4,000, that is, 3,333 1/3 centium weights of coal. He must, therefore, as before, supply 16,666 2/3 plus 3,333 1/3 centium weights, being 20,000 centium weights of coal, or 2/3 of the product, to the consumers, who would now have to pay 24,000 pounds for it instead of 20,000. In so doing, they would have to replace for him not only labor, but also a part of the constant capital. As regards the consumers, the matter would be very simple. If they wish to consume the same quantity of coal as before, they must pay 1/5 more for it, and so must spend 1/5 of their revenue less on other products, if the production costs have remained the same in every branch of production. The difficulty lies only in this. How does the producer of coal pay for the 4,000 pounds of iron, timber, etc., for which their producers do not want coal in exchange? He has sold the 3,333 1/3 centium weights, equal to this 4,000 pounds, to the consumers of coal, and has received in exchange commodities of all kinds. But these cannot enter into his consumption, or that of his laborers, but must pass into the consumption of the producers of iron, timber, etc., for he must replace in these articles the value of his 3,333 1/3 centium weights. It'll be said, it's quite a simple matter. All consumers of coal have to consume 1/5 less of all other commodities, or each of them has to give 1/5 more of his commodities for coal. The producers of iron, timber, etc. consume exactly this 1/5 more. However, it is not at first glance evident how the lowered productivity in the ironworks, machine building, timber felling, etc. is to enable their producers to consume a larger revenue than before, since the price of their articles is supposed to be equal to their values and consequently to have risen only in proportion to the diminished productivity of their labor. Now, it is assumed that iron, timber, and machinery have risen in value by 3/5, or by 60%. There are only two causes which can give rise to this. Either the iron, timber, etc. production has become less productive because the living labor used in it has become less productive, that is, a greater quantity of labor must be used to produce the same product. In this case, the producers must use 3/5 more labor than before. The rate of wages has remained the same because the lowered productivity of labor has only a passing effect on individual products. Therefore, the rate of surplus value has also remained the same. The producer needs 24 days labor where he needed 15 before, but he pays the laborers, as before, only 10 hours labor on each of the 24 working days, and makes them work 2 hours for nothing on each of these days, as previously. If the 15 workers have therefore done 150 hours of labor for themselves and 30 for him, so the 24 work 240 hours for themselves and 48 for him. Here, we don't worry about the rate of profit. Wages have only fallen insofar as they are spent in iron, timber, and machinery, which is not the case. The 24 laborers now consume 3/5 more than the 15 did before. So the coal producers can set aside correspondingly more for them from the value of the 3,333 1/3 centium weights, i.e. for their master, who pays out the wages. Alternatively, the reduced productivity in the production of iron, timber, etc. arises from the fact that parts of their constant capital, of their means of production, have become dearer. Then the same alternative applies. And finally, eventually, the reduced productivity must result in the use of a greater quantity of living labor, therefore also in increased wages, which the coal producer has partly received from the consumers in the 4,000 pounds. In the branches of production where more labor is employed, the amount of the surplus value will have risen because the number of workers employed is greater. On the other hand, the rate of profit will have fallen insofar as all component parts of their constant capital into which their own product enters have risen. Whether they themselves use a part of their own product as a means of production, or as in the case of coal, their product enters as a means of production into their own means of production. However, if their variable capital had increased more than the part of the constant capital that they have to replace, their rate of profit will also have risen, and they will participate in the consumption of a part of the 4,000 pounds. An increase in the value of the constant capital, arising from lowered productivity in the branches of labor which supply it, raises the value of the product into which it enters as constant capital, and reduces the part of the product, in kind, which replaces the newly added labor, thus making it less productive insofar as this is reckoned in its own product. For the part of the constant capital which is exchanged in kind, the position is the same as it was. The same quantity of iron, timber, and coal as before will be exchanged in kind in order to replace the iron, timber, and coal that has been used up, and in this transaction, the higher prices will balance each other. But the surplus of coal, which now forms a part of the constant capital of the coal producer and does not enter into this exchange in kind, is, as before, exchanged for revenue, in the case given above, in part not only for wages but also for profit. This revenue, however, instead of going to the former consumers, accrues to the producers in whose spheres of production a greater quantity of labor is used. That is, the number of laborers has increased. If a branch of industry produces products which enter only into individual consumption, and neither into other industries as means of production, and by means of production, constant capital is always meant here, nor into their own reproduction, as for example in agriculture, cattle raising, or the coal industry, into which coal itself enters as auxiliary material, then the annual product of this branch must always be paid for out of revenue, wages, or profit. Let us take the case of the linen given earlier. 3 yards of linen consist of 2/3 constant capital and 1/3 labor added. 1 yard of linen therefore represents labor added. If the surplus value is 25%, then 1/5 of the 1 yard represents the profit. The other 4/5 represent the reproduction of the wages. The manufacturer himself consumes the 1/5, or what is the same thing, others consume it and pay him the value, which he consumes in his own or in other commodities. To simplify the question, here, the whole profit is wrongly considered as revenue. But he expends the 4/5 of a yard again in wages. His laborers consume them as their revenue either directly or in exchange for other consumable products, whose owners consume the linen. This is the total part of the 3 yards of linen, the 1 yard, which the linen producers can themselves consume as revenue. The other 2 yards represent the manufacturer's constant capital. They must be reconverted into the conditions of production for linen, yarn, machinery, etc. From the standpoint of the manufacturer, the exchange of the 2 yards of linen is an exchange of constant capital, but he can only exchange it against the revenue of other people. So he pays for the yarn, say, with 4/5 of the 2 yards or 8/5 yards, and for the machinery with 2/5 of a yard. The spinner and machine builder in turn can each consume 1/3 of what they get. That is, the former, out of the 8/5 yards, 8/15 of a yard, the latter 2/15. Added together, 10/15 or 2/3 of a yard. But 4/3 yards must replace for them the raw material, flax, iron, coal, etc., and each of these articles in turn consists of one part which represents revenue, that is labor newly added, and another part which represents constant capital, the raw materials and fixed capital, etc. The last 1 1/3 yards, however, can only be consumed as revenue. What therefore ultimately appears as constant capital in yarn and machinery, and is used by the spinner and machine builder to replace the flax, iron, and coal, except for the part of the iron, coal, etc., which the machine builder replaces with machines, can only represent the part of the flax, iron, and coal which forms the revenue of the flax, iron, and coal producers, so that there is no constant capital to be replaced in this. That is to say, it must belong to the part of the product into which, as shown above, no part of the constant capital enters. But these producers consume what is their revenue in iron, coal, flax, etc., in linen or in other consumable products because their own products do not enter in that form, or only to a small extent, into their individual consumption. Thus, a part of the iron, flax, etc. can be exchanged for a product which only enters into individual consumption, that is linen, and in exchange for it, replace for the spinner all, and for the machine builder part, of his constant capital, while in turn, the spinner and machine builder, with a part of their yarn and machinery that represents revenue, consume linen and thereby replace the weaver's constant capital. Thus, in fact, the whole of the linen is resolved into the profits and wages of the weaver, spinner, machine builder, flax grower, and producers of coal and iron, while at the same time, they replace the whole of the constant capital for the linen manufacturer and the spinner. The account would not balance if the final producers of raw materials had to replace their own constant capital by exchange with the linen, since this is an article for individual consumption, which does not enter into any sphere of production as means of production, as part of the constant capital. The account balances because the linen bought by the flax grower, producers of coal and of iron, the machine builder, etc. with their own product replaces for them only the part of their product which consists in revenue for them, but in constant capital for those who buy their products. That is only possible because they replace the part of their product which does not consist of revenue, and which therefore cannot be exchanged for consumable products in kind, or by the exchange of constant capital for constant capital. In the example given above, it may seem strange that it is assumed that the productivity of labor in a given branch of industry has remained the same, and yet that it has fallen, if the productivity of the living labor employed in this branch of industry is reckoned in its own product. But this is very simply explained. Suppose the product of a spinner's labor is equal to 5 pounds of yarn. Assume that he needs for this only 5 pounds of cotton, that is, that there is no waste, and that a pound of yarn costs 1 shilling. We leave the machinery out of account here. That is, we suppose that its value has neither fallen nor risen. For the case we are considering, therefore, its value is equal to nil. Let the cotton cost 8 pence per pound. Of the 5 shillings which the 5 pounds of yarn costs, 40 pence, i.e. 3 shillings 4 pence, is for the cotton, and 5 times 4 pence, being 20 pence, or 1 shilling 8 pence, is the newly added labor. Of the total product, therefore, constant capital amounts to 3 shillings 4 pence, that is, 3 1/3 pounds of yarn, and labor to 1 2/3 pounds of yarn. Hence, 2/3 of the 5 pounds of yarn replace constant capital, and 1/3 of the 5 pounds of yarn, or 1 2/3 pounds, is the part of the product which pays for the labor. Assume that the price of a pound of cotton now rises by 50%, from 8 pence to 12 pence, or 1 shilling. Then we have, for 5 pounds of yarn, first 5 shillings for 5 pounds of cotton, and 1 shilling 8 pence for labor added, whose quantity, and therefore whose value expressed in money, remains the same. Thus, the 5 pounds of yarn now cost 5 shillings, plus 1 shilling 8 pence, being in total 6 shillings 8 pence. Of this 6 shilling 8 pence, however, raw material is now 5 shillings, and labor 1 shilling 8 pence. 6 shillings 8 pence, or 80 pence, of which 60 pence is for raw material and 20 for labor. Labor now only forms 20 pence of the value of the 5 pounds. On the other hand, the raw material is 3/4 or 75%. Previously, it was only 66 2/3%. As the 5 pounds of yarn now costs 80 pence, 1 pound costs 16 pence. 4 is 20 pence, the value of the newly added labor. The spinner will therefore get 1 1/4 pounds of the 5 pounds of yarn, and the other 3 3/4 pounds go for raw material. Previously, 1 2/3 pounds were for labor, profit and wages, and 3 1/3 pounds for constant capital. Reckoned in its own product, therefore, the labor has become less productive, although its productivity has remained the same, and only the raw material has gotten dearer. But it has remained equally productive because the same labor has transformed 5 pounds of cotton into 5 pounds of yarn in the same time, and the actual product of this labor, considered as use value, is only the form of yarn which has been given to the cotton. The 5 pounds of cotton has been given the form of yarn as before, with the same labor. The actual product, however, consists not only of this form of yarn, but also of the raw cotton, the material which has been put into this form, and the value of this material now forms a greater part of the total product than it did before, in proportion to the labor which gives it the form. Consequently, the same quantity of spinning labor is paid for in less yarn, or the part of the product which replaces it has become smaller. So much for that. Subsection C. Vulgar assumptions of Garnier's polemics against Smith, Garnier's relapse into physiocratic ideas, the view of unproductive laborers' consumption as the source of production, a step backwards as compared with the physiocrats. So in the first place, Garnier is wrong when he says that the whole capital is in the end always replaced by consumers' revenue, since a part of the capital can be replaced by capital and not by revenue. Secondly, it is in itself a silly statement, since revenue itself, insofar as it is not wages or wages paid by wages, revenue derived from wages, is profit on capital, or revenue derived from profit on capital. Finally, it is silly to say that the part of the capital which does not circulate, in the sense that it is not replaced by consumers' revenue, yields no profit to its possessor. In fact, conditions of production remaining the same, this part yields no profit, or rather no surplus value, but without it, capital could in no case produce its profit. Quote, all that can be deducted from this difference is that in order to employ productive people, what is required is not only the revenue of the person who enjoys their labor, but also a capital which yields profit to intermediaries, while to employ non-productive people, the revenue which pays them is most often sufficient. End quote. This one sentence is such a bundle of nonsense that it makes it clear that Garnier, the translator of Adam Smith, in fact understood nothing of what Adam Smith wrote, and in particular, had no conception whatever of the essence of the wealth of nations, namely, the view that the capitalist mode of production is the most productive mode, which it absolutely is in comparison with all previous forms. First, it is an extremely silly objection to raise against Smith, who declared that unproductive labor was labor paid directly from revenue, that, quote, to employ non-productive people, the revenue which pays them is most often sufficient. Now, however, the antithesis. Quote, in order to employ productive people, what is required is not only the revenue of the person who enjoys their labor, but also a capital which yields profit to intermediaries. How productive, then, must agricultural labor be for Mr. Garnier, which, in addition to the revenue which enjoys the product of the land, requires a capital which not only yields profit to intermediaries, but in addition a rent to the landowner? In order to employ these productive people, what is necessary is not first capital that employs them, and secondly revenue that enjoys their labor, but nothing other than capital, which produces the revenue, which enjoys the fruit of their labor. If, as a capitalist tailor, I lay out £100 in wages, this £100 produces for me, say, £120. It produces for me a revenue of £20, with which I can then, if I want to, also enjoy tailoring labor in the form of a frock coat. If, on the other hand, I buy clothes for £20 in order to wear them, it is obvious that these clothes have not created the £20 with which I buy them. And the case would be the same if I got a jobbing tailor to come to my house and made him sew coats for me for £20. In the first case, I received £20 more than I had before, and in the second case, after the transaction, I have £20 less than I had before. Moreover, I would soon realize that the tailor whom I pay directly from revenue does not make the coat as cheaply as if I bought it from the intermediary. Garnier imagines that the profit is paid by the consumer. The consumer pays the value of the commodity, and although it contains a profit for the capitalist, the commodity is cheaper for him, that is the consumer, than if he had spent his revenue directly on labor, causing it to produce on a small scale for his personal requirements. It is obvious here that Garnier has not the slightest idea of what capital is. He continues, quote, do not many unproductive workers, such as actors, musicians, etc., as a rule only receive their wages through the channel of a manager who draws profits from the capital placed in this kind of enterprise? This observation is correct, but it only shows that a part of the laborers whom Adam Smith in his second definition calls unproductive are productive, according to his first definition. It follows, therefore, that in a society in which the productive class is very numerous, it must be supposed that a large accumulation of capitals exists in the hands of intermediaries, or entrepreneurs of labor. In fact, wage labor on a mass scale is only another expression for capital on a mass scale. It is therefore not, as Smith maintains, the proportion existing between the mass of capitals and that of revenues which will determine the proportion between the productive class and the non-productive class. This latter proportion seems to depend much more on the customs and habits of the people, on the more or less advanced degree of its industry. If productive laborers are such as are paid from capital, and unproductive such as are paid from revenue, the proportion of the productive class to the unproductive class is obviously that of capital to revenue. The proportional growth of the two classes, however, will not depend only on the existing proportion of the mass of capitals to the mass of revenues. It will depend on the proportion in which the increasing revenue, that is profit, is transformed into capital or expended as revenue. Although the bourgeoisie was originally very thrifty, with the growing productivity of capital, i.e. the productivity of the laborers, it imitates the retainer system of the feudal lords. According to the latest report on the factories, 1861 or 1862, the total number of persons, managers included, employed in the factories, properly so called in the United Kingdom, was only 775,000, while the number of female servants in England alone amounted to 1 million. What a convenient arrangement it is that makes a factory girl to sweat 12 hours in a factory, so that the factory proprietor, with a part of her unpaid labor, can take into his personal service her sister as a maid, her brother as a groom, and her cousin as a soldier or policeman. Garnier's last sentence is trite tautology. He makes the proportion between the productive and the unproductive classes depend not on the proportion of capital and revenue, or rather on the mass of existing commodities which are expended in the form of capital or of revenue, but on the customs and habits of the people, on the degree of the development of its industry. In fact, capitalist production first appears at a certain stage of development of industry. As a Bonapartist senator, Garnier naturally waxes enthusiastic over lackeys and servitors in general. No class with an equal number of individuals contributes more than domestic servants to the conversion into capital of sums originating from revenue. In fact, no class provides a more worthless section of recruits for the petty bourgeoisie. Garnier does not understand how Smith, Quote, a man who has observed things with such sagacity, end quote, does not value more highly this, quote, intermediary placed close to the rich in order to gather up the scraps of revenue which the latter so thoughtlessly dissipates. He himself says in this sentence that he merely gathers up the scraps of revenue. But of what does this revenue consist? Of the unpaid labor of the productive laborer. After all these extremely worthless polemics against Smith, Garnier, relapsing into physiocracy, declares agricultural labor the only productive labor. And why? Because, quote, it creates another new value, a value which did not exist in society, even as an equivalent at the moment when this labor began to be performed, and it is this value which provides a rent to the owner of the land. So what is productive labor? Labor which produces a surplus value, a new value over and above the equivalent which it receives as wages. Smith is not to blame for Garnier's failing to understand that the exchange of capital for labor means nothing but the exchange of a commodity of a given value, equal to the given quantity of labor, for a greater quantity of labor than it itself contains, and thus creates, quote, a new value, a value which did not exist in society even as an equivalent at the moment when this labor began to be performed, end quote. Germain Garnier had published in Paris in 1796 abbreviated essentials of the principles of political economy. Along with the physiocratic view that agriculture alone is productive, another is to be found, which, to a great extent, explains his polemic against Adam Smith. Namely, that consumption, strongly represented by the unproductive laborers, is the source of production, and that the volume of the latter is to be measured by the volume of the former. The unproductive laborers satisfy artificial needs and consume material products, and are thus in every way useful. He also polemicizes, therefore, against economy, as in thrift. On page 13 of his preface, we find, quote, the fortune of an individual is enlarged by saving. The public fortune, on the contrary, derives its increase from the increase of consumption. And on page 240, in the chapter on public debts, the improvement and extension of agriculture, and consequently the progress of industry and commerce, have no other cause than the extension of artificial needs. From this, he concludes that public debts are a good thing, in that they increase these needs. In Schmalz's criticism of Smith's distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor, this German afterbirth of the physiocrats says, I observe only that Smith's distinction between productive and unproductive labor should not be considered as essential or very precise if one has regard to the fact that in general, the labor of others never produces anything for us but a saving of time, and that this saving of time is all that forms its value and its price. There is a confusion here. The value and the price of a thing is not determined by the economy of time effected through the division of labor, but I get more use value for the same value. Labor is more productive because a greater quantity of products is produced in the same time. However, as the echo of the physiocrats, he naturally could not discover value in labor time itself. The joiner, for example, who makes a table for me, and the servant who takes my letters to the post, who cleans my clothes for me or gets the things that I need, both perform a service of absolutely like nature. Both the one and the other save me time, which I myself would have to use up in doing these things, as also the time I would have to devote to acquire the skill and facility needed for them. The following remark of this same scribbler, Schmalz, is also important for the link with Garnier. For instance, his consumption system and the economic utility of vast expenditure with the physiocratic system. This system, that is Quesnay's, regards the consumption of artisans and even of those who merely consume as meritorious, because this consumption, even though in an indirect and mediated way, contributes to the growth of the nation's revenue, since, but for this consumption, the consumed products would not have been produced from the land and could not have been added to the revenue of the landowner. Section 8. Charles Ganil, Mercantilist Conception of Exchange and Exchange Value.
And hence, we get to an end point. There are still several more sections, but I think hopefully you've gotten the gist of the idea that there is distinction to be made between, what counts as revenue and what counts as production, um, production, consumption, exchange value, use value, that it is in the structure of these sets of relations, and in some ways, this question of sort of pre-consumption or pre-exchange that is also important. So value becomes, as a result, a more abstract on the one hand. On the other hand, a better way to discuss kind of the interchange among these sectors, the difference between production and, as we'll see subsequently, the difference between volume 1 and volume 2 and 3, this idea that the departments are a way of talking about this difference or distance that, is very abstract on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a way of describing this in a way that peels off, particularly at scale, surplus value. So that's kind of my little point on that. I'm going to stop share and return us to and shut the live stream off, and we'll continue this, not necessarily at to finish off this chapter, because in some ways it's a little repetitive, and we may move to the conclusion at the end, and then in order to move to the next chapter. So that's how we're going to structure, I think, the next section for next.